All right, so our first case study for cellular respiration, I want to talk about what happens when you mess with cellular respiration or when you purposefully disrupt one or more than one of the steps of cellular respiration. So the whole process is critically important for our bodies to be able to create ATP, and then ATP is needed in pretty much every cellular process as an energy delivery mechanism to allow for contraction of muscles or cell growth or neuron firing or all sorts of different things. So without ATP, you're in a lot of trouble. You may or may not have heard of a drug called DNP. And DNP has a direct effect on the cellular respiration process, and specifically on that last step, oxidative phosphorylation, that we just talked about in the previous video. So if you go ahead and look at this graph here, on the y-axis we have a number of deaths and by decade, and on the x-axis we have the decade. So we've got, the early 1900s to the early 2000s, and as you can see here, we had this big peak early in the 20th century, and then kind of ebb in the mid-century, and then nothing for most of, or the entire last half of the 1900s, and then suddenly this kind of uptick again in the early 2000s. And this is directly related to this drug that affects oxidative phosphorylation, and I want to talk about why that is. All right, so oxidative phosphorylation, summary image here. We had these two steps. We had the oxidation happening over here, oxidation of NADH and FADH2, powering the electron transport chain, creating that proton gradient. And then we had phosphorylation on the right here, where the protons were going through ATP synthase to create ATP from ADP, or to phosphorylate ADP, to add a phosphate group to it. Okay, and so DNP is messing with this process. It is not allowing for the buildup of this proton gradient at the top, which is kind of putting cellular respiration into overdrive. DNP, I can tell you, is or was marketed, well, I guess still is marketed as a weight loss drug. Take a second, pause this video, think about why a weight loss drug or weight loss would be a product of messing with cellular respiration. Why would affecting oxidative phosphorylation cause someone to lose weight? Okay, so thinking about what goes into cellular respiration, all the way back at the beginning in glycolysis, we put glucose in there, and we're breaking down these organic macromolecules into pyruvate. Pyruvate goes into the citric acid cycle, and then these energy carriers go into oxidative phosphorylation. But that very first sort of piece of the puzzle there, the glucose, or the other carbohydrates or lipids or proteins, those are coming from our diet primarily, or if we kind of use up what was coming in our bodies with our food, we can start to catabolize our own tissues. And so when somebody is losing weight, we're actually digging into the stores in our tissues to do more cellular respiration from maybe glycogen stores, for carbohydrates, or lipid stores, breaking down fat stores to continue to fuel this process. So if you can increase the cellular respiration rate, you can also increase weight loss. And so DNP was a weight loss supplement. It's currently banned by the FDA. It was banned by the FDA in the late 1930s, but it's now kind of having a resurgence on the internet, kind of on back channels, for people to use as a weight loss drug. And it does absolutely cause people to lose weight, but it also kills people. And the way that it does that is it acts as a uncoupler. And uncouplers are molecules that allow for transport across the membrane when otherwise would not occur. So remember, in oxidative phosphorylation, we build up this proton gradient in the intermembrane space, and we try to always pump hydrogen ions from the mitochondrial matrix to the intermembrane space side, so that we can have the protons flow through ATP synthase and power the phosphorylation of ADP to ATP. What DNP does is it allows for protons to flow through other parts of the membrane besides just ATP. Before, we were kind of monopolizing on the fact that there was only one pathway for the protons to flow through. If you add all of these other channels, these channels that are not harvesting energy in the process, and allow for the protons to flow through there, you destroy the concentration gradient. You go from having a lot on one side to having the same amount on both sides. And if you've got the same amount on both sides, then you do not have a concentration gradient. If you do not have a concentration gradient, you're not going to have this flow from, you're not going to have a flow from high to low, because no longer there is a high to low. No longer do you have more on one side than the other. So you're going to stop the flow of protons through ATP synthase, and if you stop that, then you are stopping the production of ATP. And this is exactly what DNP is doing. So let's go back to that main sort of image of an overview of the oxidative phosphorylation process and talk about how this is happening. Okay, so remember that we've got two steps here. We've got the oxidation step over here on the left, oxidation step over here on the left, and we've got the phosphorylation step over here on the right, and DNP specifically is inhibiting this phosphorylation step. The oxidation step is still taking place. So the body is still consuming a ton of oxygen. We're still reducing oxygen and producing water, consuming a lot of oxygen, we're pumping a lot of hydrogen across the membrane, we're releasing energy in the process of the electron transport chain, but then we've got the uncouplers coming in here. Oops. We've got the uncouplers coming in here, and let me grab my pen. And instead of only having hydrogen ions moving across into this way, we've now got hydrogen ions flowing back into this way. And so instead of building up that gradient high up here and low down here, now we have an equal amount on both sides. And since we have this kind of loss of energy that's no longer being used, no longer being harvested to create ATP, that energy is still going somewhere. And now we're just losing it in the form of heat. And so we've still got hydrogen ions moving across the membrane. We've still got electrons moving down and releasing energy in the process, but we're producing lots and lots and lots of heat over the course of this reaction without the phosphorylation of ATP. And so that's going to cause an increase in body temperature. At the same time, the body is realizing that you're not getting as much production of ATP as you normally would. And in response to a lower production of ATP, you see an increase in the cellular respiration rate earlier in the steps of the process. And so if ATP production drops, the body starts to do more glycolysis because it figures that, oh, we just need to put more of these things into oxidative phosphorylation, or we need to at least get out of glycolysis the 2 ATP that would be made in that process if we're not going to get the 30 that would be made in this process. And so we see a stimulation of glycolysis, which is going to involve a lot more consumption of glucose molecules or other organic molecules, going to have a lot of catabolism of body tissues, and that's also going to create a lot of heat in those catabolic exergonic reactions. And so we have these kind of two processes drastically increasing body temperature and can cause extreme weight loss relatively rapidly, and those two things hand in hand can end up leading to death. So will DNP allow you to lose weight? Yes. Will DNP be very harmful to your health? Also yes. So you want to avoid that if you see it somewhere. All right, so I'll meet you in the next video where we're going to talk about fermentation after a question about DNP.